Hello and welcome to another edition of WaveLab Workflows. My name is Justin, and today we're going to talk about something that may be not the most exciting topic, but I think really important topic, especially for new users, which is the preferences and settings area of WaveLab. And there's a lot of settings, there's a lot of preferences, it's very customizable. But especially if you're coming from something like Cubase or Pro Tools, you may be a little confused by some of the settings and where they are and what they do. So I'm just going to kind of go through some of the basics of, what you may be looking for when you first start using WaveLab. Like I mentioned, there's been a lot of new users. A lot of very common questions come up when people start using WaveLab. I had done a video like this a little over a year ago for WaveLab 10, and a couple things have changed since then. So between the new users, as of the new update, and some things changing with WaveLab, I thought it would be time to do a new video that just kind of goes over some of these basic things. And this one's going to be longer than that previous one I mentioned, and I'll cover the important stuff first for those that are tuning in. And then we can do more of a deep dive, some of the more detailed stuff. So thanks again for tuning in. For those of you tuning in and just listening, WaveLab 11.1 was released recently. And some exciting news is that you can now use the Pro version of WaveLab without the USB dongle, which for some people is not a big deal. For some people, it was a big deal to the point where now they're starting to actually use WaveLab because they didn't want to deal with the dongle. For me, it's nice because I have aside from the setup I'm on now, which is a Mac Pro Tower, I also have a laptop setup, and it's nice to be able to open WaveLab wherever I am on the laptop and not have to deal with USB sticks and thinking about things like that. So for me, it's been nice to have that flexibility. So we'll go over that, but hopefully everyone that had WaveLab 11 already has gotten their voucher, their download access code to update their license from the USB stick to the new Steinberg Activation Manager app. And yeah, everything should be working now. So if not, head over to the WaveLab forum and try to get that sorted out. So let's dive into the WaveLab settings and preferences. So just so people are aware, WaveLab has a preferences folder that you can access and you can back it up. I back mine up to Dropbox at least every couple weeks when I change something significant, so that reason number one, so that I can mirror the same settings over to my laptop, my secondary, and I used to have 3 computers at one time. And the other reason would be if your computer suddenly dies, gets stolen, you upgrade to a new computer, you can have all your settings backed up, and within a couple minutes, if not less, you'll have WaveLab back up and running exactly how you left it. All your preferences, your presets, your layout, everything will be just as you left it. And there's no need to spend a bunch of time redoing all your configurations. So that's a nice little feature of WaveLab. The first thing I'm going to do is show you how to find that folder, because the other thing this is useful for is sometimes WaveLab, sometimes files in the preferences folder can get corrupt, and that might prevent WaveLab from opening. That might prevent certain things from happening correctly, and sometimes the fastest way to clear that up is just to delete the preferences folder. Some people think that reinstalling the software will clear it up, and sometimes it does, but really the problem lies in the preferences folder, and reinstalling the software does not automatically clear those preferences. So, sorry, just had to make sure we were live. So reinstalling the software doesn't clear the preferences. You have to actually manually delete the folder yourself. So I'm going to show you how to find that folder. The easiest way is with WaveLab open to go to the preferences area, which I've found here. There's also the usual shortcut. And in the global general area, there's a button here called Open Setting Folder. And that's the easiest way, because when you press that button, it exposes on your computer where this folder lies. Now, I'm using a third-party finder called Pathfinder. But whether you're on Windows, Mac, whatever, pressing the Open Setting folder button will expose that. And as you can see, I've saved it as a favorite here in my sidebar. I suggest you do that too, because especially if you're going to want to be backing this up once in a while and doing things, you're going to want an easy way to get to it, because Apple has this folder exists in the library, and Apple has hidden the library by default. You can get to it. So if you're on the normal Finder, you have to hold down Option. In the Go menu, you hold on Option, the library appears, but if you don't hold on Option, it disappears. But anyways, as you can see, I have it saved over here in my sidebar, and I suggest you do that too, just so you can always get to it. Now, within the Preferences folder, there's some subfolders, Audio, which is not related to mastering audio. There's a Cache folder. We'll go through some of this. Preferences folder, which is things like your key commands. When there's a problem, the first thing I suggest doing is erasing the general.dat file. That'll clear up a lot of issues, but it will not delete your plugin or your key commands and other presets. That's kind of a less invasive way to delete everything. It's just deleting the general.dat file. But if there's a serious problem, sometimes you have to delete everything and start over. So you may even want to go back a step and just delete the whole WaveLab 11 folder. And the other reason I'm telling you this is because if you go over to the wavelabhelp.com website, you can go to presets. You can download my entire preferences folder and add it to your preferences. Now, it does wipe out anything you have, but if you're new to WaveLab and you want maybe a better starting point that's in tune with some of the tutorials I've done, go over to wavelabhelp.com and grab my presets folder. And then what you can do, like I mentioned, is go to WaveLab, choose Open Setting folder. Let me start over here to look a little more realistic. Open Setting folder. And again, that's going to expose your settings folder. And then what you'd want to do is delete everything. I would do this with WaveLab closed. I'm not going to close it on my setup here, but I would close WaveLab, delete all the preferences that are in that folder, and then go to your downloads folder and grab my version and put everything back just how you see it here. Is, the folder structure has to remain the same for it to make sense. You can't just randomly put the files in. But when you unzip my version, it will look just like this. Put it in your folder, reopen WaveLab. It'll do a long plugin scan probably, but once that happens, it just happens once. And then you'll have all my preferences and settings. You can also, like I said, kind of cherry pick if you just want my render presets. We'll go over some of this, but here's all my rendering presets. I have a metadata preset. I have a CD wizard preset. So you can kind of pick and choose your preset files that you want to steal from me as well. Or you can just do the whole folder in one easy thing. But that's, two uses for the preferences folder. One is to back up your own preferences and put them on Dropbox or something. And then two would be if you want to download my preferences. But just to be aware of where the preferences folder is, I think some users don't realize that. You can go to Preferences, Global, Open Setting folder, and there it is. So I'm going to start going through some of these preferences. I'm not going to stop on every one because a lot of them are self-explanatory, and you also have this helper. If you go over here and press the question mark, you can hover over things, and it'll do a little pop-up window for what it is. This window might not have any, but I'm not going to stop in every one because they're self-explanatory. I'm just going to hit kind of the key ones that I think new users of WaveLab tend to look over or don't realize are there, just to kind of get it working a little bit more how they're used to. But let's start in the General tab. I use the independent for each user setting. I've never experimented with this, but I believe you can synchronize. You could designate a master folder on, say, Dropbox or a network server. You could designate that as your preferences folder on all of your computers so that, in theory, it's keeping it in all your WaveLab preferences on different computers in sync. But I honestly haven't experimented with that. I prefer the manual approach of keeping it local and managing it myself so I could be sure that nothing is accidentally overwriting something else, and there's always network concerns. But in theory, that's what this area is for. It's a little bit experimental, but that is that. I'm going to go to the Display tab next, and the Display tab has a few things. I think it was just with this recent update, there's really just a light and dark theme now. There used to be sort of a in-between theme, but now there's just light and dark. I prefer the dark theme. Typically, you have to restart WaveLab for it to take effect. Another really important one that isn't going to make sense unless you have some files open, but some people don't know about this one, called Use the System File Selector to open files. And I like that because WaveLab does have a fairly advanced file browser for opening and saving and files, but I like to just use the one that's built into Mac OS because I'm used to it. That's what other programs use, so I'm just used to that. So I'll try to jump back to that when I actually have a file open, but this one I think is really important. Use the System File Selector to open files, because for me, the WaveLab file browser, I can try to show it to you here. In fact, I have it hidden, but it is pretty busy. So yeah, here it is. There's a lot going on there. And then when you save a file, it's also pretty busy. It's very advanced, so if you like that kind of thing, it's great. But for me, I really just like to keep it simple with the System File Selector. Let's keep going through here. This one's a smaller one, but I really like to have the option turned on that says undo and redo does not scroll or zoom audio. Because sometimes you're comparing an edit or seeing if something changed or didn't change. And I typically like the zoom to stay the same so I can be watching for what I'm watching for. Because if undoing and redo changes the zoom back to where it was in the scroll, then it gets hard to see what's going on. So that's a nice little setting. Show tooltips, pretty self-explanatory. A lot of these are self-explanatory. So I'm not going to show you too much more on this page, but you can control how many files are in the recent menus and things like that. But I think the main takeaway on this page is use the System File Selector to open files. I think most people prefer that, and when people find out that it exists, they're pretty happy about that. Let's go to the Audio tab. Not much here. I have the resample conversion set to best, and that's mostly for if you were to load in files of a different sample rate, you can make sure that it's resampling it with the best quality. When I'm actually working and mastering, I handle resampling with a little more detail, but it doesn't hurt to have it set to best for things like just dragging in or incidental tasks. Default fade and crossfade, these are pretty personal preferences. On the processing precision, I like to crank it up to 64-bit float. People get confused by bit depth a lot. This is just for like the internal plug-in processing. Let's say you load in a 24-bit file. Once you start doing plug-in processing, the calculations happen at a higher and more precise bit depth, and you can choose between 32 and 64. I like to use the highest precision. Just checking out some comments. So let's move on to formats. I'll just leave. This is probably just how the default settings are. There's really not much here. I don't do anything with MIDI in WaveLab, and I just use the AES standard for RMS values. So not really much to talk about in here. CD writing. Some people don't make CDs anymore. These are the settings I use. I like to keep the maximum length to 80 minutes so that even if you're not making CDs, it's good to be aware of when you're getting to be too long for a CD, because you never know if the client is going to say, we want to release this on CD. Just a little bit of a warning. That doesn't mean your project can't go over 80 minutes. It's just a little warning flag. So these are my settings for CD writing, all pretty self-explanatory and fairly default. The options, I don't like to make the task monitor visible when a task starts, and I don't need it to play a sound when it's done. But if you like that, you can. For me, it's just too much window switching and stuff going on. But you can have it. There's a task monitor when you're rendering, and the reason I don't like it is because it changes the view of one of my windows. But And there's also a task monitor bar at the very bottom, which I just use. So, and again, if you want to play a ding when a long task completes, you can do that. External applications. As of, I believe, WaveLab 10, you can set up an external editor so that if you're working in the audio montage and you want to send a little clip of audio to Spectre Layers or RX or SoundForge or any external sort of audio editor, you can do that. And it finds the applications kind of by default, although you can browse to some if you need to. And you can assign shortcuts so that, if I'm in the montage, I can highlight a section, press a shortcut, a copy of that audio will open in RX. I can do the fix. When I save and close the file in RX, toggle back to WaveLab, the fixed audio is in its spot. It's a pretty nice feature, but that's what the external applications thing is for. And then down here, there's alternative external file browser. I actually do use an alternative file browser called Pathfinder, but for whatever reason, I don't have that turned on here. I could. I'm not even sure what benefits that would bring to me, but you can try. If you use an alternative file browser, check out that setting. Diagnostics is really more for troubleshooting. If you're having some crashes, the support team might have you enter some certain things in this area. Nothing to worry about for normal usage. Let's go to audio connections. Audio connections is really, your people coming from Pro Tools. It's your playback engine settings. It's where you determine which sound card you're using or interface, and then the routing and things like that. So we're going to spend a little bit of time in here. This menu lets you choose the audio device. As you can see, I have a lot of them. You can do some renaming of the ports or the channels. This control panel, I think, is fairly important because you can set the buffer size. If you're having performance problems, you can crank it up pretty high like I do. Because, in mastering, we don't really care about latency so much. We're not trying to overdub. We really want performance. And for me, this is important. Set the device attenuation to 0 because I have a monitor controller. So I always want WaveLab and its device to be playing the full level. And I manage the volume and listening level outside of the software, but you may want this turned off if you are using speakers with digital input or some kind of interesting setup, but that's where you do that in the control panel to access the core audio. Device settings, refresh is pretty self-explanatory. It just kind of refreshes things if you're changing a lot. But what I really like is the ability to save presets, because I have two interfaces set up. I have a simple 2-channel AES interface that goes to my monitor controller, but I also have an RME card. Well, let's finish this out. Let's check out the Playback tab. As you can see, there's really only one. There's a playback bus. That's it. It's just a 2-channel AES interface. It's really simple, but it's very good and reliable. If I switch to my RME preset, you'll see that it changes the audio device to my RME AES card. And here's where I have a whole ton of playback buses and paths, as well as recording paths. And what's nice about the preset is it remembers the name and the routing and everything, so you don't have to reconfigure this. So if I'm going to do some processing through analog gear, I use the RME, and I have all this preset, but I'll show you what I did set. The main playback bus is typically 1 and 2 of your device for listening back through WaveLab, but and I did a whole episode, if you go to wavelabhelp.com, on the integration of analog gear and equipment, the routing of it. But basically what I have here is my main playback bus, and I've named all my converter paths. So the RME card in WaveLab doesn't know that it's going to the Crane Song head, but path 1 and 2 output is my main listening. Path 3 and 4 is connected to my Crane Song. Path 5 and 6 are connected to my RME. It's an interface. It's a whole different thing. 7 and 8 are connected to my Dangerous. And 9 and 10 are just going directly to my monitor controller as just raw just the raw signal without any processing. I don't want to go too deep into that, but I just wanted to point out that you can set up a ton of paths. And the key with these extra ones is that they're in the category of reference track, which means, well, if you go to main playback bus, it's going to be the main playback bus. But these allow me to send it to, these allow me to send reference tracks to different alternate outputs to feed the analog gear, and then I record it back to a new track. And then in the recording, you can choose the path. Like I said, left is AES3 and right is AES4. If you go to the playback bus, it's 1 and 2. So you can see all your ins and outs here. And on the recording side, AES3 and 4 is the input of the Crane song, and AES is a little out of order because I've added things, but AES 1 and 2 input is the Neve converter. So you can get really customized. You can name these things. External effects is a plugin that you can use. I don't choose to use it, but it's another way of sending audio to and from external outputs. And then the Options tab has a couple interesting things. It has the ASIO guard. It's a little bit like a buffer in a way. I just keep it set in the middle. You can perform a short fade in or fade out on playback, which prevents any ticks and pops. If you're using multiple programs at the same time, it could be useful to release the driver when WaveLab is in the background, or when Cubase or Nuendo is in the foreground if you're going between the two. Preferred sample rate is really nothing. I didn't even realize it was set to 44.1. That could be for when you make a new generic file and things like that. So that is the audio connections area. Again, you can choose your variety of interfaces right here. Save presets. I'm going to check a question here. To record like from YouTube or something, you typically need another piece of software that routes that. There's Audio Hijack from Rogue Amoeba. There's Loopback. WaveLab can't just choose Safari to record from. It needs, it can only choose audio devices and inputs. It can't record it can if you use something in the middle that captures the audio from YouTube. So it is possible, but you do need another piece of software to manage that. It can't record directly from your internet browser, but there's ways around it. There's people that have made software for it. So let's move on to the Shortcuts tab. You can really customize shortcuts in WaveLab. In fact, I came from Pro Tools, so years ago, I programmed T as zoom and R as zoom out. And those who use Pro Tools know that those are the shortcuts in Pro Tools. And I just kept them that way. I'm just kind of used to it. Obviously, you can use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out as well. But let's get back to the Shortcuts tab. So you can really customize shortcuts quite a bit in WaveLab. And you can even search for them. I'm trying to think of one to search for. Well, I'm sure copy has a lot. So copy is used in a lot of contexts, but if you want to customize something, let me use something that isn't so, like the CD Wizard. To call up the CD Wizard window, I have Control C. But if I wanted to change it, I could just double click on it and type in my own shortcut and save it, things like that. So anything you can think of, you can search for it to see if it's something you can have a shortcut for, like move markers. There's a command in the montage for moving multiple markers. I've programmed a shortcut. So it's really customizable to program shortcuts. And this is where you can do all that. They're categorized. And of course, if you go to your preferences folder, they're stored in the key shortcuts.dat file. So just be aware of that. But that's another good reason to sort of back up your preferences folder once in a while. So again, if there's a problem with your computer, or if you can keep all these things backed up and you're back up and running in seconds. So that's the extent of the shortcut. And you can search name. You can search, some of these shortcuts have descriptions in the bottom. So, let's see if the CD Wizard does. Yeah, so there's little descriptions down here. So you can choose what you're searching. Searching name usually works well enough for me. me just clear that out. So the next tab is the plugins tab. There's kind of a lot going on in here too. As you can see, I have a lot of ignored plugins from over the years that I just wouldn't use in WaveLab. I don't even know where some of these came from. But one thing people sometimes need to do is force a plugin scan. If a plugin isn't showing up in WaveLab, you can force it to scan on the next launch. There is a new setting here that I don't have turned on for the purposes of this video, but you can ignore updated plugins. If you have this on, it can cut down on plugin scanning times. You know, if you install a package of plugins, but it can also lead to some errors. So it's a little bit of it has pros and cons, but if you're tired of longer plugin scans, you may want to try this option. If a plugin isn't showing up, you may need to disable it, force a plugin scan. If you're really having problems, sometimes I just go into the preferences folder and delete this plugin. Well, where is it? Yeah, the plugin. I believe that's the one. Plugin settings no, it's in the cache. I'm sorry. Plugin registry.txt file. If you delete this, this is kind of like a hard reset of your plugin scanning. So if you delete this file, it'll do a plugin scan as well. It seems to be a little more heavy duty. I've had cases where redoing a plugin scan doesn't fix it, but deleting the plugin registry file doesn't work. And if you're on an M1, there's two versions of these files, so you may have to delete both of them or the one you're using. I'm still using an Intel Mac for my main setup, but on my laptop it's M1, and I noticed that there's two plugin registry files, one for ARM for the M1 mode, and then one for the Rosetta mode. So that is that. If you use the Supervision plugin, there is a setting to use multi-core processing for that plugin, just because it has a lot of graphics going on. That's about it. Oh yeah, this is a kind of important area. I have mine organized in a certain way so that, you know, if I look in my plugin menu, it's organized by the company that makes it. I have some favorites assigned here. These three little marks, kind of like the Adidas symbol, that means it's a VST3 plugin. If you'll notice, UAD is still VST2 only. They're just barely rolling out the VST3 versions. So if you don't see the three marks, it means it's a VST2 plugin. I tend to use VST3 whenever possible. Sometimes the VST3 version has a bug and the VST2 version works better, but I try. As you can see, all my favorites, aside from UAD, are VST3. So you can have a favorites section, and of course they're organized. I have mine organized by plugin vendor. You can search for a plugin. So if I just search EQ, any plugin that has EQ in the name is going to show up in this list. So it's nice to be able to search things like that. I did a whole video on plugins as well, all the places you can insert plugins in WaveLab, so I'm not going to get too deep into that in this video. But I did want to show you that in the plugins menu. Let's go to a simple one and a good one. Fabfilter has great plugins. So as you can see, I have all the VST2 versions disabled. I have this. The reason they weren't showing up in my normal menu is because they're disabled. So if you have plugins that you don't use for WaveLab, you know, like vocal tuning or drum sampling or just stuff you wouldn't use in mastering, you can turn them off so you don't have to look at them. For me, I've turned off all the VST2 versions of Fabfilter, all the VST3 on it, but then you can also determine which section they're in. Without getting too deep, WaveLab, the master section of WaveLab has the normal effects area. It has final effects, which comes after the resampling. It's a place to put dithering and a final limiter, and then dithering. It has a playback processing slot for just plugins you want to hear and see but not be part of the rendering path, like room correction, additional meters. I just did a whole video on the master section. You can go back and watch that. But this is where you determine where plugins are available to be inserted. Let's go back to Fabfilter. So we have the final effects slot, we have the normal effects, which is anywhere in the montage, as well as the effects section of the master section. We have final, which I just talked about after the resampler. Play stands for playback processing. So you can see I have this TC Electronics Clarity M plugin that talks to my hardware meter. I have that chosen to be available in the playback processing slots. But if you go to the master section, you'll notice there's only a few plugins available in the playback processing area, and that's typically things like headphone correction, room EQ. Steinberg has the encoder checker. You know, not every plugin is available in the playback processing by default, but if you're using something like SonarWorks and it's not available, if it's not showing up in the playback processing slots, then you probably want to go into this area and enable it in the play section. You just press the checkbox and then it will show up in that section. Another thing that comes up is, for whatever reason, the WaveLab has a mode where plugins can just show a generic interface. You know, instead of all the fancy knobs, buttons, it can just show sliders. Some people like that for some reason because it's, I don't know why. It's just it's a little more dry look. It doesn't, you're not influenced by how it looks, just how it sounds. But for some reason, the generic box, which is GEN, sometimes that's gotten selected for certain plugins, and I don't know why. So let me just select it for Pro Q3 and then open Pro Q3 and show you what happens. Where is it? It's nowhere. Well, this is the fun of live streaming. But basically, with the Gen box showing, let me try it with one other plugin. With the Gen box showing, you get a very generic interface, and some people think it's a plugin bug, but a lot of times it's just somehow the Gen box got chosen. So if that ever happens to you, go in here and just see if somehow it got selected, and chances are you just have to unselect the Gen box, and then you'll see the normal interface. After that is out. Allows you to specify the channel layout. Yeah, so it's the layout option. Then the more important one here is the crown. That's where you can select your favorites. So like I showed you in this list, we got favorite plugins. The reason this list is so short, it's because it's only plugins that I went through and checked this favorites box. So that's kind of an overview of the plugins area. Over here is, you know, where you can sort it by how I have it sorted. There's a hierarchy. There's all sorts of stuff that I just kind of have set how I like it. So you can look how I have it. You can grab my settings, but this is how I like the plugin menu to look. Is usually I think of a name and then a certain plugin that I want to use. So I like this layout a lot. Let's move on. Let me close this montage because it was being a little goofy, and go to next one is remote devices. I don't use any remote devices like an external controller. For me, there's not a lot of use for that in mastering. You know, mixing and production, I could see why you would want some kind of controller. For mastering, I have a Stream Deck, which is outside of WaveLab, but it works well for combining shortcuts. Let's say you always do this, and then you always do that, and then you hit OK. You can program the Stream Deck, or Keyboard Maestro is a piece of software for Mac. You can program that to do multiple key commands in one press. WaveLab doesn't necessarily have macros directly, but between Keyboard Maestro for my laptop and Stream Deck for my main setup, I don't feel any slowdowns there. Folders, it's hard to explain what this does, but let's say you have a audio montage and you're going to open something. This just determines what you see. Do you keep the last used folder? Does it change when the save folder changes? These are going to be really user personal settings. I've kind of, for me, this is a set it and forget it area. I haven't looked in this area in years, but WaveLab does what I need it to do as far as when I when I go to save a file, is it saving it where I want it automatically so I don't have to dig through paths and tell it to do the same thing every time. WaveLab is kind of intelligent where if you create a montage, load in some files, and press save, it's going to know that you probably want to save the montage right next to where all the audio files are sitting. So it keeps things organized. But you can customize things in here as you wish. Variables. Another area that it's kind of set it and forget it. I don't think I've even really deviated from the default settings. And if I have, I haven't looked at it in years. So this is not an area we need to really talk about. But it starts to get more interesting again here. And for those that are new to WaveLab, WaveLab has essentially two environments to work in. It has the audio editor, which is the audio editor is, let me see here, to open a file. The audio editor is just like a direct destructive environment. I don't use it a lot for actual work. I use it for checking incoming files, checking outgoing files, analyzing files. And then it has the audio montage, which is where I actually do the work. And as you can see, some plugins are going to load. This is where you probably actually assemble and master an album and things like that. So that's why we're seeing two sets of preferences. We have preferences for the audio files, and we have preferences for the montages. Just checking my notes to make sure I didn't miss anything. I think we're good. So let's go through these settings. So these get a little more detailed and interesting. Just grabbing a sip of water. It's been hot. So let's start with the start here. Audio files. Again, I've talked about this in more depth in other videos, but the first setting to be aware of is the companion file. Companion files are really useful for audio files because if you open an audio file and you put plugins in the master section to process it, which is something I don't do, but some people do, in order to save those plugins with the file, you have to save the master section. It gets saved in a companion file. And with this setting turned off, the companion file will be right next to the WAV file, which is what you want. There's a reason that I can't remember that I have this setting turned on because I don't use that method of working at all. And for some reason, when I had this disabled, it was creating an extra file somewhere that I didn't want to see every time. So basically, my companion files are going into an independent folder, which is, as you can see, a very random path that needs to be updated because it's still saying WaveLab Pro 9, and I'm in 11. But anyways, the reason this is a dangerous setting for some people is your plugins for each audio file could be getting saved in a hidden folder that you never see or think about. And if you move the file to a new computer, you get a new computer, those settings are going to be gone. So be careful of that. But this is the setting I use because, again, I do all my work in the audio montage, whether it's a single EP or an album. So that's why I can have it set this way. The next setting is an overview. I don't use it, but let's see what happens here. It's been a while. Basically, what it can have is a nice overview of the entire file so that when you're zoomed in, maybe it's because it's not a new audio file, but when you're zoomed in, it'll still show an overview of the whole waveform at the top, and it's smaller. I don't like it because it just takes up space. It doesn't show me a lot of detail that I couldn't just see if I zoomed out. So I have that turned off, obviously. I'm going to get to some more important ones. I'm going to skip through some of these because you can, again, read through them and yourself and decide. But the important ones for new users, I like the process whole file if there's no selection setting. Things like that. But the real annoying one that people ask me about a lot is sometimes you get these GPK files, stands for graphic peak files, right next to your WAV files. And they're annoying because let's say you render an album's worth of WAV files to send your client, and now you got these graphic peak files sitting right now. You don't want to send the graphic peak files to your client. They're going to get confused. They just make a big mess, and they're unnecessary. WaveLab needs them, but no one else does. So the setting you want to look for is this one right here, which is create peak files in an independent folder. And you can, when you selected it, this is the default path. And again, it's set to 9. I probably need to, I don't know why it didn't change it. I've been using these settings for a long time. It doesn't really matter in my opinion. The thing that matters is that it's going to be, when you're rendering and creating files, you're not going to see these graphic peak files next to the WAV files because they just get in the way. I know some people that have gone years just manually deleting them, which is kind of unfortunate. But the good news is you can just use this setting. It's not on by default, which is why I mentioned it. By default, it's off. You have to turn it on. By turning it on, the peak files will go to a random folder that you never think about, and it gets auto-deleted once in a while. And you don't have to worry about those GPK files, those graphic peak files. You can write, markers can be written and stored in the WAV file metadata. Whether or not other programs can read it is another story. But you can also write the markers in a separate file. I believe it's a MRK file. I choose to just put them in the file because either way, I think having the marker as a separate file is kind of useless because you don't want to have to send it separately and the person's software is going to be able to see it or not. So I don't really have a use for the marker files. So for example, when I'm rendering a vinyl master, it's one long file per side. I of course send a cue sheet from WaveLab that tells the person where each song starts, but if the person is using a DAW that can read markers embedded in a file, they also get a nice marker where each song starts for that vinyl cutting, so that's handy. Anyways, that's another setting on this page. And then the style, you can really customize the colors of the waveforms. I haven't put much time into that, but I've seen some people come up with some pretty elaborate color schemes for their wave files. Anytime Katie Tavini posts a picture of her WaveLab setup, it's got a cool kind of rainbow color. I don't know how, maybe she'd be willing to share that. I've just haven't had time to customize it, but you can customize everything about the waveform, whether it's the background color, it gets really deep. I just haven't had time to play with the style, but if you have that kind of time and are interested, I think the possibilities are pretty much endless for customizing the colors. So let's go to the audio montage. I'm going to open a montage so that I can get to some of these settings because some of them are for the active montage. Default gap. This is for when you insert multiple audio files in the montage at one time. I like it to be set to 0 because I like to manually adjust the spacing between songs kind of by ear and feel and any notes the client may have. So I just started at 0 because there's also times where if I'm just assembling something that's already been sequenced, using this setting, then there's absolutely no space. Or just for test, sometimes I'm testing. Sometimes I'll render some master files and then I'll load them into a fresh montage to test, quality control them. And when I do that, I want, of course, 0 seconds added between them so I can make sure the transitions are correct. There's no ticks and pops. So I keep mine set to 0 for that reason. Some people set it to 2 seconds so that when they are starting to assemble an album or EP, it's got kind of that default 2-second setting. But for me, that doesn't work because the end of the song is debatable. If it has a long ring out, Windows, it's a long story, but I keep mine set to 0. That works for me. You can change it for the default gap between clips. And of course, you can obviously drag them around once you're in the session. DVD audio, I don't do any of that kind of work. It's just been set to 24. Folder for audio files. This is for if you are recording inside the montage or doing some type of processing within the montage that creates new files, such as the external editor that I talked about. I could highlight this, press a key command, it sends that audio to external editor. So the data folder is for, let's get back to that. The data folder is for any new audio that WaveLab creates. By default, it's just called data. That works for me, but you can call it anything you want. You could call it the name of you can customize it is what I'm trying to say, but by default, that's the name. And that's going to exist right next to wherever the montage file is. It creates that for you. Similar to if you're using Pro Tools, there's the Pro Tools session file, and then there's the audio files folder right next to it. Similar to that. A couple other settings: reset plugins when starting playback. For some reason, I have that off. Reset plugins before rendering, I have that on. That's worked for me for many years. I did learn today, actually, that someone was having a problem with Acoustica plugins. There was a bug. The very first few milliseconds of the render had a fade in of some kind. For whatever reason, disabling this setting here fixed that problem. Normally this is a setting that helps plugin rendering, but in the case of Acoustica plugins, having it the opposite way helps. So that's, use it however is working best for you. This is how I keep mine. Autosave master section preset. You'll want to go to my other videos, but I basically don't use the master section for any processing of plugins. I know when you first get WaveLab and it looks like this, it's very tempting to just start putting plugins in the master section, but that's not really a great way to work, in my opinion. There's the inspector. You can have clip effects for plugins right on each song, and it's all saved within the montage. The master section is not saved within the montage. I'm going to flip back to my preferred layout. The master section is not automatically saved with the montage, and more importantly, not automatically loaded. You have to manage it separately. This particular setting, however, will save the master section setting when you close the montage, but for me, it's all a little bit too dangerous for me to have that kind of workflow. Again, your opinion could differ from that, but that's the reason I don't have this box checked, is because I don't even use the master section. In fact, I have it set up so that the master section loads the same every time, which means my Clarity M plugin is always there. There's always no plugins. It's always set to 0. The faders are locked. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that, but I have a setting so that the master section is kind of invisible for my workflow. I can just close it, hide it. Let's go to the all audio montage settings. Pretty basic stuff. How many backup, it does save, WaveLab does save montage backups in a little backup folder next to the real montage. These are a lot of default settings. Do not save. I like this because if you open a montage just to check it and don't save any or don't do anything, and you just close it, it won't even save or update the timestamp, which can be good for like when versions change, because montages can sometimes be not backwards compatible. For me, that's the safest choice. Nothing to worry about too much, but I just like that setting. Let's see, clip time ruler. There's a cool feature in WaveLab where it puts a little ruler right on each clip to show you the length of that clip, which is obviously different than the timeline of the whole session. And this setting just determines if it's the length of the actual clip or is it the length of how you've trimmed it. I'll show you more about that when we get in there, but I keep that off. There's nudging in WaveLab, of course, and you can control. I wish this went to like quarter dB steps, but you can nudge things up and down by a decibel. Let's see, some important ones. As of somewhat recently, WaveLab has multi-core processing. I have that turned on. I don't use a lot of track effects. I'm usually using clip effects and montage output effects, but this setting can potentially help with plugin, rendering if you're using track effects, if it detects silence. Kind of important stuff here. I'll just try to zoom in on all of them. WaveLab has a very cool feature where you can replace an audio file with a new source. Let's say you've done some mastering work. Somebody sends you a new mix file. They say, I had to update the mix. Can you just load it into your session? With WaveLab, you can press a key command and tell it to reference a new file. So you don't have to reinsert your effects or redo your fades or your automation for volume, anything like that. It's a way to load in a new file and keep all the settings the same. But a setting to be aware of is synchronize the clip length with the audio file. This is for when, sometimes the new file could have a slightly different length. Maybe someone was a little careless when they made the new file and It's a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. So this is a personal preference kind of setting, but you could just be aware that it's there. And then if there is any difference in time, it'll you can have it shift the clips to the right so that, kind of the space, the distance between the clip you're editing and the next one remains the same or not. So these are kind of things you got to watch for as you're doing it, but be aware that if you find yourself doing it a lot, there's these settings to help you out. Really, really good ones here is the envelopes on clips. So within the montage, you can, of course, automate the level of each clip and the panning and things like that. And you can choose to do that before the clip effects, which would be, you have your songs in the montage. You can put an EQ right on each song. You can choose to have the volume envelopes be before the plugins or after. And it's really more important for, dynamics plugins like compressors, limiters, de-essers. You have to decide if you're going to automate the level of a song, say the verses are too quiet or the beginning you want to bump it up. You have to decide if you want that level change to happen before your clip effects or after. And you can do that in the montage, but there's a setting for, the default setting for when you insert a clip. So for me, the default, I always have it so that my volume and fades are before the clip effects. Same with the panning, but you can change it to after. And of course, like I said, you can change it in the middle of a session. This is just so that you're not constantly having to adjust it every time you insert something and want to do that. So, and again, with the style, you can really customize the background of the waveforms. You've probably seen some older users of WaveLab where it looks very like red, white, and blue. The newer version of WaveLab is a little more modernized, and you can really go crazy with the color schemes and stuff like that. So I'm going to check my notes again. There's a few more settings to go over, but we're kind of getting through some of the main stuff. If you do grab my preferences, for reasons I don't, and there was talk, actually I'm talking about two different things, but if you do grab my preferences, you may notice that, and this is kind of a loud master, so forgive me, but you may notice that the loudness meter is in a different scale than you're used to. That's for whatever reason, the default, let's put it to the factory default and see what happens. So you'll notice that by default, it's telling me that this particular song is plus 14, whatever, loudness units. Now, that's more of a broadcast scale, and European broadcast, and it's even a little dated from what I can tell. I'm not in the broadcast world. But typically when we talk about music, we say that streaming services are going to normalize your songs to minus 14 LUFS, or when you master to minus 8 LUFS, like this particular, some of these songs, that's kind of getting loud, things like that. So I have it set, I have my own default, what's called JP start, and that does it full scale, so that when I play a song, it looks more like this. So this is kind of what we're used to talking about music. The verse of the song is minus 11 LUFS. So for whatever reason, when you import my preferences, this preference file is a hidden file. So even if you've grabbed my preferences, you may see the loudness meter in a scale that you're not used to and don't care for. So all you have to do is right-click in this area, go to Settings, find the menu, and if you've imported all my preferences, you're going to find my preferred scale, which you might like as well. There's so many customizations you can do with colors and ranges, but you can do it however you like and press apply. You can, of course, save it as a preset, and I typically never have to go in this area unless I'm explaining this to somebody. This will be remembered every time. But I just wanted to mention that for those that have grabbed my presets. For some reason, that's an invisible file, and you just have to manually select it that first time. Speaking of default settings, let me just make a new montage that's a little cleaner here. Okay. as I've talked about, I did a whole video on plugin where you can insert plugins and things like that. One thing that's kind of new to WaveLab still, so I'm mentioning it, is you can set up default settings for plugins. So one plugin in particular that I use kind of a lot when I'm in the box is this one. And the default settings on it were terrible for mastering. It sounded like a metal zone distortion pedal. So I'm very thankful that WaveLab, you can of course save your own presets, but now you can go in the menu and choose default preset, save as default preset, so that whenever you open this plugin or any plugin, it's going to be set kind of how you like it as a starting point. Whether it's an EQ, for example, everybody seems to like this EQ. Again, I'm not doing any EQ moves, but I have some popular problem areas. I have some settings of, how wide is the Q, the what kind of filters, all that stuff. You can kind of save a default starting point for when you insert plugins. Now you can, of course, load entire plugin chain presets as well with the good starting points. So here's a whole huge plugin chain that I've loaded, and they all have unique settings. But I'm just talking about if you're working and you say, oh, this sounds pretty good, but I just want to add this one other plugin. As of somewhat recently, you can define a default starting point for any plugin, any VST3 plugin. For VST2, I don't believe it's there. So that's worth mentioning. Another thing that people tend to grab of mine, if they already have a setup going, is render presets. I have a whole bunch of presets here for various rendering scenarios. When I'm working in a montage, as you can see in my videos, the first thing I do is render the whole thing as one file, and then I work my way down. But there's all these presets because there's so many render settings, what the source is, the format, all this stuff. So you can save render presets. As you can see, I have a whole bunch of them. And kind of a cool thing with WaveLab is this organize presets option. You'll see it in a lot of menus, whether it's the CD wizard, just about any menu has it. It exposes on your computer where all these are stored. So you could download my presets, my preferences folder, unzip it, and you can just grab my rendering presets. So you can figure out where yours are stored and then go to that same path in mine and then drag, copy and paste or drag them over to your preferences folder, and then they'll be there when you look in these areas. So that's a nice thing I like about WaveLab. But just be aware of render presets, because the render presets also handle some of these options like copying the markers. I always bypass the master section when rendering because I'm not doing any processing in there. And it's just kind of a safety net. There shouldn't, in theory, the settings shouldn't make a difference because I don't have any plugins there. But why not bypass it just to be safe? So render presets, really cool part of WaveLab, saves you a lot of time. You can even render multiple formats like WAV and MP3. The reason I don't do that is because then you can't manage the dithering on those separate renders, so it gets a little goofy. But with the way I work, it's so fast I just do them one at a time. It's pretty automated with metadata and stuff like that. And speaking of metadata, if you just want to grab my metadata preset, you just go to that tab. Of course, download from the site, but to figure out where it is on your system, just go to Organize Presets, and there it is. Pretty handy. So checking my list, we're getting kind of down there. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I did a whole video on all the metering, so I'm not going to get into the metering, but like the time code, it's empty because this is just one song and there's no CD tracks yet, but I could go to clip start. I'm not even sure I had this on my list, but I did a whole thing on metering and I included the time code. I want to talk about the transport. Another big thing that people get hung up on is, I think by default, out of the box, WaveLab is set up so that when you press play and then press stop, it doesn't and then press play again, it just continues on and it doesn't jump back to where you started. I think most people like it how I have it set, where when I press stop, it jumps back, so you can kind of keep hearing the same part over and over again. And I think by default, WaveLab is not set that way. Now you're probably wondering, where is my transport? As you can see, this is the you can save layout presets as well, as you can see in this list. This is the default layout of WaveLab, and there's still some things missing because I can tell that the transport's not there. But here's where you find this little icon here. I have the transport hidden, and that's because I only use the transport to stop and start playback, which I use the spacebar for. There's a key command to record. There's even a key command to turn looping on and off, which is the slash right above the 9 on the number pad. You can customize that. I really don't need the transport, and it just takes, by hiding it, I get a little bit of space back. Not much, but every little bit helps. So the reason I wanted to show you the transport is because you have to right-click on the stop button, and you can, I think by default these are unchecked. You want to check them so that when you stop playback, it jumps back to where it was instead of just continuing on like a tape would. So that's another thing that people get hung up on when they first start using WaveLab. Now, as you can see, I have my own default layout, and you'll see the master section goes away, and you'll see that the inspector is up here. And the reason for that is, I think it was WaveLab 9 or so, maybe 10. They changed prior to WaveLab 10, the montage effects used to be up there, and I'm just used to them being there, so I put them back in my preferred layout. Because as I've mentioned, I don't use the master section. I have it on a shortcut to be visible if I need it, but I keep it pretty empty and set flat. So I like to have the inspector up here. Really, the only logical reason is because that's where it used to be, and I just am used to it up there, and I like it up there because I'm doing all my work inside the montage. So I just wanted to mention that. And speaking of the master section, again, I did a whole video on it, but I used the settings. I'm just going to tell you one setting in here, and that is restore configuration at next startup. And that's because, as I mentioned, I always want this plugin to be loaded. I'll open it up here so we can see what's going on. I always want resampling off. I want the plug, and more importantly, I want the faders to be at 0, and I want them to be locked. It's too easy to, with the scroll wheel, accidentally move the faders. Let me unlock it. You know, I can accidentally scroll, and now it's a little bit off, and your reference to the outside world is now a little bit off. So I keep them snapped to 0. I keep it locked. If you want to see more about the master section, watch the previous video I did. But my whole point here was I use the option here that restores my last configuration. Now, if I was using plugins, I probably wouldn't want to restore that configuration, because then when I open a different file, that file is going to be going through those other plugins. But for me, this works because I keep the master section clean, and it always comes back how I left it. So I'm going to go back again to my default layout, and we're going to move on to just a couple last things. Really, there's only one last thing I want to talk about, and that's just file management. WaveLab does not copy in the files for you. It loads them in, but when you make a new, let me make a new montage, and let me try to find something here. Something I worked on. Obviously, this is all stuff I worked on, but something that makes sense to load in. This is kind of an ambiguous one. So let's say I load in these 4 files, put them in, you know, I can pick the order that they're in. WaveLab did not make a copy of those files. It's just referencing where those files came from. So you have to be kind of diligent about your file management. And when I used to teach at a tech school, I used to use WaveLab for the mastering class, and my advice was, you know, set up the folder structure first. You know, if you go into my folders here, let's see if I have one that I haven't really started on yet. So I have the original files here. I always make an original files folder first, and then when you go to make a montage and save it, it'll put the montage file right there. But like my main point here is WaveLab is not going to copy the files into your session folder for you. You have to be a little bit forward thinking about, where are you don't want to just drag in files from your downloads folder or your desktop or some random place. You want to be thoughtful about where do the source files live, and do I want them, where want them there. There is a little bit of a trick that I don't even rely on, because I don't even want to have to rely on this, but you can go, if you have a mess on your hands, you can go to new audio montage from current file. You can choose duplicate and recreate audio files. This will kind of make a new montage for you. Here's all the options. I could just save it to my desktop to be simple for the sake of this video. This is kind of like create session copy in Pro Tools. There's a whole lot of options, and I can't really read them and talk at the same time, but I'm going to press OK and see what happens. But it looks like what it did here is it just it grabbed all the sources and made a new montage file and put it in one place. So it kind of helps you clean up your mess, but I don't, that's probably the second time I've ever even done that. And I've probably only done it for explanation purposes. I don't like to rely on it, but just be aware that you want to be thoughtful about where your file management before you start. So I'm going to check my notes. I think we're just about through everything I wanted to touch on. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, we have a Facebook users group. We have a WaveLab users group on Facebook. It's a good place to ask questions. We have the WaveLab Help website, which has downloads to all my preferences, settings, all the videos I've done so far, links to other resources. There's the WaveLab forum on the Steinberg website, where a lot of other helpful people are there, including the developer of WaveLab, can help answer questions, feature requests, things like that. So it looks like we're good on the questions. I know there's a little bit of a lag, and I'm just looking through my notes. I think I've touched on everything, and even if I missed something, I wouldn't want to have it hiding at the end of this video. But thanks again for watching. We'll do one again next week. So for all the new users of WaveLab, welcome. There is a bit of a learning curve, as you can see, but I've been using WaveLab over 10 years now. I think it's a really great mastering program, especially if you want to stay on Mac. It's just really great. It just takes a little bit of time to adjust your way of thinking from a mixing and recording DAW to WaveLab, because WaveLab just has all these mastering specific things like markers, and these are different than location markers. These are track markers, metadata, CD text, really great metering, all this stuff that is a little bit more mastering focused. So, all right, well, thanks again for watching. For those of you that are new to WaveLab, we do these just about every month. There's usually some promotion online.